So we'll touch on, I suppose, both recovery and regeneration today then. I suppose both exercise modes and nutrition modes. So I'm happy to start off with the nutrition mode, I guess, or the nutrition section that we'll talk about. And even within that, so what fits under that bill as far as I'd see, if that's okay?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. And then I'll pass it over to you for the exercise or the regen part of it. So definitely with the recovery side, and feel free to jump in here at any time, is like, I suppose, broken into different times of the year to start off with. So you're periodizing your recovery, and it's definitely something I look to do this year. But depending on the time of the year and depending on your goal, depending on how you're trying to adapt from a training session, will dictate your recovery. And what I mean by that is, from a nutrition perspective, that'll alter your nutrient intake after sessions. So like if you're in pre-season and you're periodizing your recovery and you're wanting to manipulate your carbohydrate intake, then that will be a pre-season focus. However, coming into games, maybe for a 6-set turnaround, you wouldn't be reducing your carbohydrate intake after sessions. You'll be replacing as soon as possible. So that's what I mean by periodizing your recovery. Within that then, there's probably a couple of different phases of recovery, and probably phase 1 and phase 2 is how I see it. Within phase 1, you'd look at the 3 R's, so something like rehydrate, restore the glycogen you've used, and repair the muscles you've used. And that'll be in an acute sense after training and after matches. And after training, I guess, it's like how soon can you meet those recommendations? So if it's 30 grams of protein, 60 grams of carbs, and 500 mils of fluid, or after match, it's the same, replacing what you've used. That's in an acute sense. And then that's phase 1. So in phase 2, then you look at the day after, or even the night after. So the day after, like, what are the things you need to meet the day after a game? Would likely be just meeting your protein requirements, 2.5 grams per kg body weight or very close to it. Maybe replacing your carbohydrates if you've if you've used let's say 1,500 to 2,000 calories in the game. You're having a high carbohydrate breakfast first thing in the morning, and then maybe it's low carb for the rest of the day, considering it's a Sunday. So that's what I mean by phase 1 and phase 2 recovery. So you have your R in an acute sense, and then from a phase 2, what are the demands of that day and what are you trying to achieve? Probably repair your muscles as soon as possible is the primary aim. That'll be the first thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's interesting as you're talking about the phases, like these line up with regeneration as well. And what are you trying to manage? You know, like phase 1. I'm just looking at a text that I got from a mate of mine today, and we've been talking about this idea of the time course of fatigue and defining them a little bit just as a framework. Like you're saying, that first phase is the acute, you know, that 0 to 24 hours, the acute phase. Then you go to this like 24 to 72 hour period, which is the subacute or the residual phase. And that's where, you know, like we've talked about in one of these prior coronaversations, is that, you know, that's when you're first measuring your neuromuscular status, where you're seeing changes in muscle tissue. I think, you know, we talked about that. There might be muscle tissue damage. So like you're talking about now, and then you go into that sort of beyond 72 hours as you're preparing for the next game, you're talking about that persistent sort of fatigue, and therefore recovery and regeneration modalities. So I think that's like just defining those 3 sort of phases, looking at the time course of them. So 0 to 24, 24 to 72, and then beyond 72 to the game. Those phases are going to dictate what it is you need to work on the most. And even as you're talking about recovery there, and you're saying like, okay, immediate post-game process. How do we get enough protein, enough carbohydrate in? You know, the 3 R's they're incredibly important in that 0 to 24. And then you start going from, 24 to 72, that diverges a little bit. So yeah, like there's some of the fringes as well. Can you go back to the 0 to 24 for me though, and talk a little bit around? I think you mentioned the antioxidants, I think, but how they affect. Yeah, dive in on that, like,
Yep.
because I think if we stay with that time course, that gives a better, like a fuller picture of what it is we're trying to achieve in that time. And then after that, I might dive in on a couple of those like acute regeneration practices there.
Okay, yeah. So the 0 to 24 hour thing then, like a lot of the research definitely says the most important thing is the macronutrients. So, like I said, the restore and repair. But there is enough reviews at this stage on the antioxidant side of it, and if that's a game, for example, and that's 0 to 24 hours, like we take with hard cherry juice immediately after games, or in some cases even vitamin C supplementation. Like I suppose it's suppressing free radicals, and that can be induced from high intensity efforts or collisions during rugby. And I guess what you're trying to achieve is less muscle soreness in essence. And definitely with the high antioxidant intake of tart cherry juice, maybe inducing inducing melatonin to help with better sleep as well. So there is, I won't say a lot, but definitely like a medium to strong evidence base for antioxidant supplementation, like vitamin C, as I said there about the tart cherry juice as well. You're just trying to reduce the amount of free radicals in circulation, and they will come from high collisions, repeat intensity efforts. The idea in the, as you mentioned, Dave, in the 0 to 24 hours after a game, that's when they're most prudent. However, in pre-season, for certain kind of metabolic adaptations, like you're neglecting antioxidants, so you're attempting to, I suppose, in a simple sense, trying to recover without suppressing those free radicals, like find a way to recover yourself. So I think that kind of makes sense in a huge sense. 0 to 24 hours.
I think
regeneration. Go on.
Oh, no, I was going to say, like, in that 0 to 24 hours, it's interesting because you got like this really clear, around a game, you got this really clear sort of primary concern, or primary outcome that you're trying to reach, which is reducing inflammation in that acute period so that your turnaround time to be able to train again is quicker. So in that acute phase, reducing the inflammation, reducing the discomfort felt from some of that acute damage or that acute fatigue is really important. So where those regen practices, where the active side comes in is, the importance of utilizing cold. So a cold bath, cold tub, cold compression, stuff like that. The use of stretching, mobility, tissue rolling, and like light massage in order to mobilize some of the blood, the pooled blood and the pooled metabolic sort of leftover that you've got. So hydrogen or lactic acid, if that's easier for you to think about, mobilizing some of that through your body to push it into lymph and squeeze it out. Just the act of rolling is a really important active practice during that time. And when I think about regeneration, there's three categories that, and we've spoken about this as a staff before, and we've sort of presented to all of the players at different times. But there's an active portion, passive portion, and a mental portion. And in the active portion, for me, would be like that rolling, stretching. The passive would be the cold. You're letting it happen to you. And then the mental regeneration after a game. Letting go of a loss, celebrating a win. There's that. The importance of that period to allow that to be the focus, but then removing that as you go on. And I know that's not so much an exercise focus, but certainly the pain of a loss might be alleviated by sitting in a cold tub. It'll certainly, even the pain, even the ego of a win will certainly get shrunk, no pun intended, by sitting in a cold tub.
Okay, yeah, that's really good, and definitely around the 0 to 24 hour, that's really clear practices.
Yeah.
What would you see then?
Sorry, just to jump in. And if you're in preseason, you're almost looking at the opposite. Like you said, with your nutritional processes, you're looking for that adaptation. So you don't want to stunt that by dumping cortisol on into your system by sitting in cold. You actually want to maybe extend that out a little bit, allow that repair process to happen a little bit more naturally. So maybe the thing that you're looking for is a little bit more heat. Maybe it's that driving the hormonal cascade of repair to get IGF-1, to get, some of the human growth hormone stimulation that a sauna might provide. Doing that in a safe way, like I'm not saying bench press in the sauna, that's a shit idea. But if you were to go and like get in the sauna at the end of the day and extend out that recovery a little bit, get that endorphin push, you might be able to actually get a little bit more adaptation. I think the rolling and the stretching remains constant. And then the mental might already be done. You might have been doing that in the gym when you get crushed by the weight if you've got a bit of an ego, or you might have boosted your ego a little bit by hitting a PR, you know?
Okay. So I think you've mentioned a couple of things there that are constant. So you've mentioned a couple of things like that are constant. So the rolling, the stretching, the mobility, that's constant. Definitely from the recovery side, the things that I'd see constant are protein, a consistent protein intake, and recovery immediately after sessions. I'd see sleep as a constant, not just 24 to 72 hours, but 72 to game. This is an entire season, so if it's sleep quality, definitely over, I guess, quantity, but quantity is critical too. But I think if you can manifest sleep quality, sleeping without disturbances, restful sleep, dark room, everything that we kind of know already, but sleep quality is paramount. And I think, as I mentioned about antioxidants, have maybe a medium evidence-based, sleep has a high evidence base. So prioritizing sleep quality as a recovery strategy 365 days of the year, I think. Would you see any other areas from a regen standpoint, or have you mentioned them there that are constant?
I think when you start looking at, you get along that time course, so you go into that second phase, or the what I call it before, the subacute, or the residual sort of fatigue. One of the most important things to do from a regen standpoint is activate that hormonal cascade again. So to start getting yourself into the flow of actively regenerating muscle tissue, working on creating range of motion and tension under load. So I think one of the most important constants within that phase, within that sort of 24 to 72 hour in particular, whether it's in season or within a preseason, is to start lifting again, is to start getting yourself under load. And it's an easy one to say, like, oh, well, let's not lift because we need to prioritize something else. I think the more consistently you apply that stimulus, the more regenerative it becomes for you in the positive hormonal cascade sense. Then also from a priming point of view, and you might be talking pre-game or pre-session, just that ability to prime your body neuromuscularly and hormonally by doing a couple of heavy or a couple of fast lifts has that real benefit. And we see that in our environment, in the primer that we do prior to a pitch on a Thursday. It's also our last strength session, because I think any time after that, when we start getting in that later time course, or if you haven't been able to alleviate the fatigue or alleviate the sort of the hindrances from 24 to 72 hours, after that we start compounding fatigue a little bit, right? Unless it's very acute, unless it's a real potentiation type of protocol where we're within sort of 30 to 90 minutes of the next activity. But that primer is sort of like the last stimulus. And I think when you get something like that, it can actually be really beneficial. And I think all the stimuli that's been applied beforehand is a really important, not just developmental process, but a regeneration process, and helps prime you for the next one. It's like it's concurrent training in any of its forms. In preseason, we have session on session recover, session on session recover, because we're trying to get that cycle of adaptation hormonally, physically, neuromuscularly. We're trying to create that resilience to load and tension, but also get the positives out of the hormonal cascade that you get from lifting. So I'd see that as a constant. In that sort of residual area as well, I think there lives in a cycle of either a contrast or a hot or a cold exposure, but then also, just that constant tip away at mobility and stability. And I know that looks like normal training a lot of the time. We have an acute session of that in movement health, but I think just that priming of mobility, of range of motion at a joint, across a number of joints, the tissue tension in between. So massage, rolling, needling, acupuncture, whatever works really well for you in that space, those are constants. I think they're things that roll all the way through. How you apply hot and cold, again, comes back to the adaptation that you need. So as you're getting further away, or you're far enough away from the game that it won't have a depressing effect, and it's far enough away from your primary stimulus that you've been able to adapt, cold is really appropriate. If you're looking for adaptations and looking for ways to get tissue sliding better, then heat is really appropriate, and we need to apply that at the right time. And the balance of that is a little bit individual, and it's not trial and error, but it's sort of judgment based on what sort of training you're doing, how the effects of your other regeneration are, and then what's the outcome that you're looking for in the end.
Cool. Yeah, I think that's really good synopsis of regeneration, both acute and, I suppose, as I mentioned, subacute, but definitely residual as well, and going beyond even 72 hours to an entire season. So
getting into that persistent, and I think that's where this ties back. Like a regen practice might be a nap or a visualization or some really quiet time, which fits in really well with your sleep. Like I said to you just before, you can't out regen poor recovery. So if you're not eating well and sleeping well, and you get to that persistent phase and you go, oh, it's okay, I'll just top up with a couple of naps. Well, I mean, it's silly. Like I had a mate who used to say, well, why worry about caffeine unless you've got good sleep? Like you can't out caffeinate poor sleep. You can't, out creatine poor lifting. Like it's just you've got to be feeding it from both sides. And I think that's where you start seeing the balance between recovery and regeneration really peaking together in that, like you said, that periodized fashion to result in performance.
Cool. I think that's a nice cue to leave it there. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a nice chunk of info.
Yep. Happy days. Fair play.
Cool. All right, bud.
That's right. Have I no idea if I stopped that or started it? There we go.
Go to more actions and recording.
Are you sure you want to